The Hawkesbury River is located northwest of Sydney, Australia, and is home to the second largest commercial coastal fishery of prawns, oysters and fish in New South Wales. Encircling the metropolitan region of Sydney, the river is trawled for seafood on a regular basis, with fishing nets scouring the waters hoping for a big catch. However, in August 1994, one crew caught more than they bargained for, as from the depths of the riverbed they would bring to the surface one of Australia's greatest ever mysteries. On Thursday the 11th of August 1994, the Lady Marian and its crew began their workday like any other, calmly cruising up the Hawkesbury River, casting its nets out to trawl for fish. Around midday, as Mark Peterson and his crew dragged their nets back onto deck, they noticed that they had caught onto a large, rusting steel frame with several decaying plastic bags attached. At first glance, the crew noticed that one of the bags had a small bone poking out from it, and considered it must have been from the carcass of an animal. When they looked closer, however, they noticed even more skeletal remains attached to the frame, and soon realised it was far more sinister than first thought. The steel frame itself was an unusual shape and nothing like anyone had seen before, and the skeleton had been clearly tied to it in a crucifixion-like manner. Mark immediately called the Broken Bay Water Police, who escorted the Lady Marian back to shore to have the skeleton examined, which was quickly confirmed as being that of a male human. Whilst the circumstances of how this person ended up in the river was unknown, it was clear to everyone at the time that the man on the crucifix was victim to a very deliberate and meticulous murder. An investigation soon began into who this man was and what could have led to his demise. Scientists at the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Glebe estimated that the body and steel frame had been submerged for somewhere between 6 to 12 months before it was discovered. The cause of death was determined as being several significant blows to the head with a blunt instrument, suggesting the man was dead, or at the least seriously injured before sinking to the bottom of the riverbed. The description of the victim was difficult to determine at first, as his body had decomposed so significantly that fingerprints and facial features had eroded. He was believed to have been Caucasian, of Mediterranean or Eastern European descent, possibly Italian or Austrian, between 5'2" to 5'4", and aged between 21 and 46. His hair colour was dark brown. He had straight teeth, one of which was missing and most likely removed when he was young, with no fillings. He had no personal belongings on him other than a packet of cigarettes and a lighter, whilst his clothes were an Everything Australia polo shirt and no sweat tracksuit bottoms. A facial reconstruction was done based on the man's bone structure, with the images circulating on TV and newspapers in the hopes that someone would recognise him. Using the skull of the victim, scientists were able to create a physical model of what they believed the man looked like, and would later go on to create a digital composite based on this estimate. With forensics completely in the dark on the man's identity, he was only known at the time as Unknown Human Remains E48293, although he became widely known to the public as Rackman, due to the manner in which he was found attached to the steel crucifix. The so-called crucifix, which has conflicting pictures and descriptions, was reportedly as follows. It was made from a 1.82 metre length of flat metal onto which someone had welded two cylindrical solid metal bars. Between the bars, two pieces of reinforcing rod had been attached and bent into a restrictive L shape over the man's body. Wires and ropes were wrapped tightly around the torso, wrists and neck to ensure that the body was secured on the frame, whilst the remains of the plastic bags were strewn across different parts of the makeshift crucifix. What made this find even more chilling was that, after analysing the contraption, investigators were confident that the crucifix was custom built for the victim, with the steel frame matching the man's wingspan perfectly. It was also far too heavy for a single person to have lifted and dumped into the river, which suggested that more than one person was involved in the death of Rackman. Another picture of the supposed rack emerged in the media at the time, although it's unclear whether or not this is the actual device itself or an unrelated object mistaken for it. With DNA technology still in its early years, police struggled to make headway into uncovering who this mysterious man was, and relied purely on witnesses to come forward who believed they recognised the facial reconstruction. A $100,000 reward was offered to anyone who could accurately identify Rackman, but no credible information was received. With no missing persons reports matching the description, either nobody knew who this man was, or those who did were purposely remaining quiet. Police initially looked into the potential of this being a gangland killing, believing that perhaps the manner in which Rackman was murdered was to put out a message to others. They also went as far as considering the murder to be linked to a possible satanic cult, with the symbol of the crucifix leaning strongly towards the idea of a religious persecution. There were a number of religious-based cults operating in New South Wales in the mid-90s that had been investigated previously on numerous occasions for crimes ranging from child abuse to violent rituals, although there was no concrete evidence to suggest that this was the work of a religious group. As time went by, many different leads provided by the public saw police investigate a number of missing person cases. The first was convicted drug dealer Joe Biviano, who was born in 1963 and had gone missing from the Sydney suburb area of Drummoyne in December of 1993. On face value, Joe fitted the bill. He was the right age, had dark hair, was of Mediterranean appearance and was roughly 5'4". With members of the public considering he looked like the facial reconstruction, police looked into this lead closer, but were unable to track Joe's dental records, meaning they had to turn to DNA samples for confirmation. Unfortunately, these samples didn't match with Rackman, and so police carried on looking for other potential leads. Another potential match was Greek businessman Peter Matrice, who was last seen near King's Cross in April 1991. Police previously received information that Peter had been beaten to death, with his body being dumped into the ocean near Sydney. The only problem this time was that Peter was around 5'9", far taller than Rackman, whilst Peter's sister also suggested that her brother's teeth were more crooked than that of the facial reconstruction. Others believed that the body could have belonged to that of Christopher Dale Flannery, known infamously as Mr. Rent-A-Kill. Flannery was alleged to have been an Australian hitman and was accused of multiple murders of high-profile Australian citizens, including a barrister, a brothel owner, and an undercover Sydney drug squad detective. After evading conviction and being acquitted multiple times, Flannery, who had deep connections with gangland crime in Australia, disappeared under mysterious and suspicious circumstances. On May the 9th, 1985, after surviving a shooting attempt on him and his family, Flannery received a phone call from George Freeman, asking for a meeting. Flannery previously worked as a bodyguard for Freeman, who was linked to illegal casino operations and considered a crime boss by Australian authorities. Flannery's car wouldn't start when leaving for their rendezvous, so contacted Freeman, who suggested he take a taxi. Flannery did so, and after exiting his residence, he was never seen again. Many people believe that Flannery was murdered either before, during, or after the meeting with Freeman. And after accruing many enemies over the years, it's easy to see how one could come to this conclusion. With an unidentifiable man now found in what looked to be a gangland-style killing, connections were quickly made linking Flannery to Rackman. Unfortunately, the mystery was to remain unsolved when dental records proved that the two bodies were not a match, and the search continued for E48293. Attention then turned to Stephen Bryan, who at the time of his disappearance told his friends James and Christine that he'd spend Christmas with them in Tucabia in New South Wales. Sadly, he never showed up, and police suspect from their inquiries that he may have been involved in a drug gang related incident which led to his demise. The final possibility was that the remains were those of a known gambler by the name of Max Tenchevsky, whose partner last saw him in January 1993 at Newtown, Sydney. At the time of his disappearance, Matt was in possession of $1,800 in cash, which supposedly wasn't out of the ordinary for him. He allegedly travelled to the Gold Coast regularly to go on gambling binges, but would always come home a few days later, regardless of how successful his outing would be. In January of 1993, however, Max never returned. With DNA unable to prove definitively that either Bryan or Tenchevsky were the Rackman, police continued to search for answers, but with no clue on who he was, E48293 remained at the Glebe morgue for nearly a quarter of a century, waiting for the day he would hopefully be named. 24 years later, he finally was. After years of development in DNA technology, the identity of Rackman was revealed in August 2018, and it turned out that a previous guess on who the man was proved to be correct. New South Wales Deputy State Coroner Paul McMahon officially ruled that the mysterious remains belonged to 37-year-old Max Tenchevsky, a prolific gambler from Newtown who disappeared during a trip to the Gold Coast. Little is known about Tenchevsky prior to his disappearance, although there was no evidence to suggest that he had any connection with the criminal underworld in Australia. He was known to carry some debt due to his addiction to gambling, but the exact sum of his arrears are unknown. All that is known is that Tenchevsky withdrew $1,800 from his accounts on the day he went missing, presumably to use in his ventures in the Gold Coast. And it's likely that money was either lost or stolen leading up to the fateful day he was found on the crucifix. At this point, it seems that little progression has been made into finding out what happened to Tenchevsky, with people still theorising why and how he ended up in the Hawkesbury River. It's strongly theorised that the manner in which Tenchevsky was killed and then crucified suggests that he may have been victim to a gangland-style killing, with police initially considering that idea when the body was first discovered. Some believe that, being a gambling addict riddled with debts, Tenchevsky may have owed money to the wrong type of people, and after failing to pay them back, it could be that his killers decided to make an example of him, sending a message out to anyone else who owed them money that this would be their fate if they failed to meet demands. Unfortunately, no evidence backs up these claims, and no further information has come to light on what happened to Tenchevsky, with his death remaining a mystery to this day. Max Tenchevsky's death is certainly a tragic case, and it's hard to tell if any future developments will surface and provide further clarity on what happened to him. Unless someone comes forward with verifiable information, Tenchevsky's fate will most likely remain a mystery forever, and Australia will forever wonder who murdered him so dreadfully. Whilst that part of the puzzle remains incomplete, at least for now we can say that the Rackman of Hawkesbury River finally has his identity back, and won't be just labelled by a number or a nickname. Instead, he can be rightfully remembered as Max Tanchevsky of Newtown, Sydney, and he can, at long last, rest in peace. Thanks everyone for watching. If you like this video, please leave a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel if you're interested in more content like this. If you want me to cover a particular story, you can send me an email, it's just on my YouTube channel, or you can leave a comment below on this video. Thanks again for watching, I'll see you on the next one.